Our next project is going to be based off of an abstraction of your previous Nature's Complexities drawing. Now, some of you may have heard of the term abstraction before. Abstraction is really what we're going to focus in on this PowerPoint. We're going to talk a little bit about what abstraction is and how you can use it to create your next drawing. So abstraction is a part of the visual language of art. So abstract art is really looking at the language of form, color, line, and texture to create compositions with a degree of independence from visual references in the work. So as we're going to see, there are various levels of abstraction and how far you go away from that original visual reference. In this case, the visual reference is going to be your Nature's Complexities drawing. And as we look at some examples, we're going to think about this idea about that departure from reality and how far, whether it be slight, partial, or complete, you want to go with your abstraction. So the first slide we're going to look at is Cézanne's Mount Saint Victor. Cézanne is really known as the first abstract artist. Now, Cézanne is considered a post-impressionist. He was very interested in the nature of mark making with color and style. So I think when we look at this now, it's very clear that you see a mountain, right, with a town below. And it was based off of a real mountain. This is actually another painting of the same mountain just from 10 years prior. And you can see this is really representational art. Everything looks exactly the way it's meant to look. Comparing it to Cézanne's work, you can see how there's been liberties taken with color, with line, with shapes, how much things are defined, how little they are defined. And that's really what we're looking at when we're talking about abstract art. And Cézanne came back to the same mountain again and again. So, and how much he deviated from depicting exactly what was in front of him, the way it looked, sort of like we talked about in Nature's Complexities, really focusing in on those details, really varies. So we're really stepping away from that. In this piece, it's still going to be based off of that same original representative work. It's just going to be, you're going to try to focus in on some very distinct changes. So when we're talking about abstraction, we're really thinking about what a artwork is made out of. So that can be considered what is known as the components of art. So the first one would be the subject matter, right? That's the what, the person, the thing. In this case, our subject matter is going to be our Nature's Complexities drawing. The content. This is the why. So the message, the emotional, the intellectual. When you start to work in abstraction, you can start to actually change things to be more emotional or intellectual. You can selectively change colors. You can leave out details or exaggerate details to kind of push that emotional or intellectual message you're interested in showing. There's also the context, meaning the background that the artist is from or the culture that the piece was made in. Sometimes some of those abstractions can be made in order to bring some context to the artwork, specifically like certain color choices were only available at certain times. You'll see that with Impressionist work. Or maybe you want to reference something specifically. So, for example, you're very interested in anime and they have a very particular way they define edges and lines, and that's something that you want to reference in your work. And the last is the form. So that means the design of the elements and principles. We, as artists, you're oftentimes abstracting just based off of the form, right? You want to emphasize a certain focal point in your piece, so you're making everything less detailed. That is really a form of abstraction, right? You're changing the way the original representative piece looks in order to create a more unifying composition. So that's also something that you're thinking about in abstraction. And like we talked about, this idea that when we're choosing abstraction, it's really on a scale. And that scale goes anywhere from representational, right? You're representing an idea that you can actually see what is there, to the other end of it, non-representational, meaning there's no reference to the subject matter or form. You're only looking at form or content. And, as you start to think about your piece, you can think about, where do you want to fall on this range of abstraction? Do you want to really almost get to where it's almost non-representational, where it's hard to find that original reference in your Nature's Complexities work? Or are you going to go on the other end of the scale, where it's a lot closer to reality? And, when you're thinking about this, like we said, when something is representational, it's very objective. It looks exactly like the object that you're trying to recreate. We were really thinking about that in our first piece, right? We were trying to really look at the very little details of the object that you found and trying to recreate those details. As you start to move away on that scale, you get into where you can start to change things to push that emotion or an idea. And in realism, you're starting to think about stepping away from that exact representation and emphasizing the things that make it more emotional. So trying to tug at, the viewer's heartstrings a little bit. You can change the color. You can change the focal point. You're really pushing the content of your drawing. Semi-abstraction is where you start to distort more things, right? That you are intentionally changing the colors, the shape, the size. You're making things bigger or smaller. Think about that's something that you could use in your piece, right? And how you could alter it to really push that idea. And as we start to move down that abstraction scale, things start to look less and less like the original, right? Until it just becomes about the form and how those elements of art are put together. So you're really just thinking about the composition itself. You probably see no reference to the original subject matter at all. And, that's what I want you to think about at the start of this piece. How far down that scale do you want to go? And so I'm just going to show some examples of some various artworks that are on this scale somewhere, and I want you to think about where these might fall. The first work here is a work from from the Hudson River School, and actually this piece can be seen in the DeYoung, if you're ever interested in seeing it. And it's actually a picture of the West, right? And this exact piece, although it looks very realistic, is actually an abstraction. The Hudson River School artists were very interested in the American landscape and pushing people to move westward, showing kind of the beauty and the wild of the West. And so the artist actually put together sort of two different landscapes. You can see the area below on the right is a landscaped area that has a lot of agriculture. The area on the left is the wild, right? It's the untamed landscape. And oftentimes artists think about, they're trying to juxtapose those two sides, so they've taken some compositional liberties, right? This looks like it could be something that you could actually see out there in the wild, but the artist has sort of created this romanticized idea of reality. And so romanticism is actually a type of artwork, or it's a genre of artwork that seems like a realistic example that would be out there in the world, but it's changed things to make things more beautiful or more wild, to sort of emphasize a cultural ideal. So that's something you can think about too. This is a form of extraction. You're altering things, but it's obviously closer to that, that more realistic end of abstraction. Now, this is as we sort of start to move into the 20th century, you'll see artists take more liberties, even more liberties with what they're changing and what they're abstracting. This is also a landscape, but it's very different from the piece we looked at before, right? Think about what has changed. The artists have moved completely away from natural colors, right? There are realistic proportions, especially if you look at the way the trees are drawn in the hills and the houses get smaller and go back in perspective, right? But what has completely altered is sort of the artist's grip on what colors are actually out there in the world. The artist has simplified them, right? By using mostly primary colors, although there is some other, secondary, tertiary colors also thrown in there. And the artist has also simplified their mark making. Instead of blending together where you will see each little individual blade of grass, you start to see texture that's meant to mimic the look of grass or, leaves, to create the texture in those places. And while today this does not seem like that revolutionary of an idea, artists at this time were really pushing what could be defined as a painting. This is right after the invention of photography. Prior to that, paintings had to be representative of the real world. They were sort of a stand-in for photography. A painting was seen as documenting reality. Afterwards, artists began to think about, well, painting can be something else, right? It can be imaginative. It can be a totally unique space that's been created out of the artist's mind. So even though there's a reference to an actual place, the artist has taken liberties in how that place is represented. As we start moving further into the 20th century, you can see artists take more and more liberties, both with color and with proportion and size and what things are realistically meant to look like. Matisse is seen as one of the masters of what is known as, expressionism and the Fauvists. Fauvists considers themselves liberated from color accuracy. That you don't see those same kind of like repetitive brush strokes. Instead, they're really focusing on color fields and composition and how the viewers flow throughout a piece. So thinking about, compositional tools that will really interest the viewer and keep them engaged in the work. And you can see that just with the way in which the color is sort of spread around the piece. The little dots of yellow being spread out, the pink are spread out in a way that the pink is the sky, but the pink is a person in the foreground. So you can kind of think about that, like he's changed the color by what he thinks would look good in the composition versus what realistically was actually in front of him. So that could be a way you could think about abstraction as well. Expressionism is the next form of abstraction that a lot of artists explored. And in this case, they're still thinking about color and how they can change color from reality. But the expressionists saw color as a way to express a mood or emotion. So they were changing the color in order to sort of create some kind of emotional content. And you can see in this piece, what would you think the emotional content would be? Does it seem happy? No, right. It's very anxious, almost a little bit scary. And he's also abstracted the way and proportions of people to kind of make them feel a little almost spooky or, anxious. You can see that little girl in the middle looks like she could come into your nightmares, right? It's got that kind of like anxious feeling to it. And so instead of, like we said again, painting things exactly the way that they are, the artist has taken creative liberties in those proportions and those colors. Cubism is the next kind of abstraction that was explored. This is probably, when people think of abstraction, they often think of Cubism. They're sort of intertwined. And in Cubism, instead of really pushing the color palette, initially Cubism was all about reducing the color palette, having a very minimal color palette. In this case, really just focusing on complementary colors, oranges and blues. So reducing it so there's, less variety. It also is reducing the number of shapes and forms, breaking things down to their most simplest form. So if you look at an arm, it's actually a cylinder. If you look at the body, it's actually a triangle. So it's actually simplifying those forms down. It also is very interested in possibly showing multiple viewpoints at once. Picasso was also very influenced by African masks, although that reference has a very troubling history. He often talked about want to go back to a childlike state or primitivism, saying like that was one of the reasons he was looking at African masks, and denying the fact that African masks have an own craft and history and, skill making, the same as Western art. It has its own unique aesthetics of what makes it good or bad. And Picasso, this is probably too lengthy of discussion to have right now, but Picasso, in some ways claimed to revel in African masks, but at the same time, the things that he said was not respectful of the history of craft within those works of art. Braque also was a contemporary of Picasso and one of the main artists associated with Cubism. And as you can see, he was very interested also in the simplified colors, simplified shapes, very muted color palette. You can see very sort of like browns, muted greens. And as he goes on in his work, right now you can still see a reference to the original subject matter, but just simplified shapes and forms. This is a castle, right? You can still see the reference to the castle and the houses. The further he gets along, it's more difficult to find. This one in particular, you can see it's called The Immigrant. It's very hard to find that reference to the person, right? Because it's so abstracted, so simplified forms, so muted color palette. Everything sort of becomes one another. And I feel like the easiest reference you can see is to his guitar. You can see the strings right there in the little circle, sort of towards the middle bottom of the page. But it starts to become very difficult, right? It's so abstracted, you're starting to lose reference to the original subject matter. And as you can see, this one's untitled. It's very hard to really determine, as he moves on in this abstraction process, what the original subject matter was. Is this a person? Is this a house? Is this a guitar? It's very hard to tell, right? The further and further Braque moves along in his abstraction. And Picasso, actually, as he moved along in his abstraction, he actually becomes more whimsical with how he creates the forms. They're still very simplified. You can see this is a band, sort of that same theme that Braque was looking at. But he starts to use still simplified shapes and forms, but uses collage to help him create those simplified forms. It almost starts to look like something you might see in a children's book, right? Telling the story. So he sort of goes the opposite direction and starts bringing back in more color eventually. Sometimes artists are influenced by previous works just for their content, once in the subject matter, but they're less tied to the overall composition. This work by Velázquez, this is a piece called The Maidens. You can see it's actually a piece. Velázquez is actually there on the left. You can see him. He put himself painting the portrait of the Spanish court. And this is Miro's inspiration or abstraction of the maidens, where, it's difficult. What you can kind of see, like you can see there on the left, there is the painting, the easel with those two sticks going up. And then you can see the guy with the blue and red face. That's Velázquez there with the little mustache. You can pick him out by the mustache. The rest of the characters are much more difficult to tell. They're running around. They're, kind of in similar places. But it's sort of like a whimsical take on it. It's almost if you changed it into like a fairy tale with funny little characters. So this is actually a different form of abstraction, right? It's almost kind of an illustrative version of it. Another work that I wanted to look at is Mondrian. You can see he was very interested in actually some of the same themes that we are looking at, nature's complexities. His earliest works were really focused on like tree branches, tree roots, how they intersected, how they intertwined. And that eventually became the works that he is most famously known for, right? This is actually an abstraction of a tree and the intertwining connection of those tree branches. So if you simplify them all down to squares and shapes, and it eventually becomes the work that he's most well known for, that his very simplified series of squares and rectangles. And he believed that if you took everything down to its most simplest form, everything becomes lines or shapes or squares and the primary colors. So he saw himself as taking abstraction down to its final end, right? If you take things to the extreme, this is what your painting will look like. So you can think about it like that. If you want it, do you want to push it to that furthest end where it becomes non-representational, or do you want to push it to that side where it is more looks like reality? And I'm just going to end by looking at one artist who actually really thinks about this idea of abstraction and realism. It's Rachel Stein. You can see in these pieces, oftentimes she recreates one in the same piece, where on the left that is a picture of her dog. On the right that is also a picture of her dog. And she sees these both within her skill set as an artist, right? She can realistically paint the dog, but she can also sort of express her own inner emotions about the dog. And oftentimes she puts them in the same piece, right? The dog is very realistically painted, while the surroundings of the dog, the landscape that it's laying in, the other objects surrounding it, become those abstractions. So playing around with what we abstract is what she's really interested in as artists, and how it changes the meaning of the piece. Like I said, oftentimes she does that in the same piece. So you can actually see she has some very realistically painted flowers. She has a realistically painted picture of the dog because, as you know, in contemporary painting and drawing, oftentimes the references that we're using are photographs. And she's sort of showing, look, when you're recreating, when you're painting from a photograph, are we recreating that object, or are we recreating a photograph of that object, right? And how that re-representation changes when you're using a photograph. Oftentimes she's thinking about that. Or playing with what details are made realistic, what details are left abstract, or oftentimes playing with the surroundings around them. Like this is a recreated drawing. The background itself is actually a painted version of a tile that a painting is hanged on. So sort of multiple layers of recreation, which is another form of abstraction. All right, so for your abstraction of your nature's complexities drawing, you can be anywhere on that scale of abstraction, being very close to reality to very far from reality. I want you to think about what you want to change and why. Where do you fit on that scale, right? Do you want it to be parts of it be very close to reality while other parts become completely abstracted? You don't have to have the exact same composition as your original. That's something that you're free to change, right? That's part of the abstraction part of the piece. Think about what you can do to really emphasize some of those emotional or intellectual parts of your drawing. How can you make changes that will make your piece feel more compelling? All right. So we're getting started with that drawing this week, and we'll have some discussion posts that will hopefully help you sort out your ideas.